I'm Alex Bartholomew, CEO of People Stretch Solutions, and we're going to put on a good show today and talk about breaking the boundaries between marketing and sales. Now, at People Stretch Solutions, our focus is sales effectiveness, strategy, OKR consulting, and leadership development. And we find ourselves in a lot of conversations about the challenges between marketing and sales. Now, to help me with today's conversation, I've got my colleague, James Whitman. James, do a quick introduction for our listeners.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Really delighted to be part of this discussion. I've had a long career in sales and revenue management. I've led sales, I've led marketing, a lot of different environments. So this discussion is really near and dear to me. And I think it's a really important set of questions as we explore really what the post-pandemic environment for selling and marketing looks like. I think we'll have some great discussion about these dynamics across marketing and sales.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. And for today, as we go through the program, we love getting questions from everyone. Just drop it in chat, and we like it early and often, and we'll pause along the way as we get into the different aspects of the challenges between marketing and sales. And so please submit your questions through chat. Also want to give a shout out. Our webinars would not be possible if it wasn't for our great producer, Truett Dill. Truett, say hello to our listeners today.
Hey, everybody.
Great. So Truett's going to help us monitor the chat, and we'll look forward to getting your questions. Along the way, we'll also be asking you a couple polling questions. So let's just set the stage. You know, oftentimes we saw before the pandemic, this friction that existed between sales, marketing and sales. And so in this friction, organizations, especially in the mid-market where People Stretch does most of its work, there was always, they just couldn't get on the same page, and there was this wall. And so a great factoid we saw from marketing's perspective, marketing is very proud, and a good marketing organization is vital to a sales team's success. Now, one of the big things is creating leads. And so when marketing goes out of their way to create leads and sales doesn't follow up with them, man, that is a recipe for disaster. So today we're going to try to unpack those tension points. And hopefully, as we unpack the tension points, we can actually break the wall and bring it down and help you and your organization have sales and marketing engage at a higher level. So let's actually look at the anatomy of when sales and marketing is collaborating effectively and an organization is performing at a high level in customer acquisition. It all starts with leadership. And how is leadership, the leadership of the organization between the C-suite, sales and marketing, how are they collaborating? Oftentimes, the highest functioning organizations seem to be spending more time collaborating in order to be able to manage revenue management. And revenue management is a new term that's come of age over the last 10 years, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. But that's a common positive that organizations where leadership, the C-suite, sales and marketing have an ongoing dialogue and collaborate, well, you see high performance. The second part of high performance is that marketing and sales agree on the tools and the process of how they're trying to get this prospect over here. And we've got our key, so as I'm talking, you can learn more about our viewpoint, but you've got marketing having developed in an aligned and collaborative way with sales, brand positioning and thought leadership content. And then you have sales taking that same brand positioning and thought leadership content and engaging in the right tactics. Now, what's driving consistency for both teams are those tools. For marketing, it's marketing automation. For sales, it's CRM. Now, if those tools don't have a unifying process, well, that could be a source of problem. High functioning organizations have a unifying process in the middle, and that unifying process generally has the concepts of targeting, research, planning, and execution. And as we've worked with probably over 200 sales organizations at this point, we've seen that marketing has its set of tactics, from content, email, webinars, events, sales with leveraging introductions, reaching out via calling and networking. Those are the primary tactics that organizations that perform at a high level, they're actually doing well across most of them. They're not relying on just one to drive their success. They're actually relying on probably being good at least 4 or 5 of them. Now, prior to the pandemic, we started seeing a lot of challenges. We started seeing that there was friction. And so here and today, we're going to discuss those areas of friction on the revenue management side, on the marketing side, on the sales side, and on the tactics side. And hopefully that's going to help everyone have a far better understanding about which of those friction areas are going on in your organization. So to start, we're going to dig in and we're going to hear from James the question that we oftentimes ask: who owns the choreography of sales and marketing? And so James, based on some of the clients you've been interacting with for the last few years, who's owning the choreography of sales and marketing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and indeed one that we've faced for a long time. I have a real bias towards having sales take the lead, partially from where I've generally sat in the organization, but more importantly, in terms of ultimate accountability. Sales has to transact, and all activity needs to support that goal. So working backwards from the client, working backwards from that transaction has a certain logic. That said, it's got to be this, Fred and Ginger relationship that is truly choreographed and harmonized across the different activities. The relationship between the sales lead and the marketing lead has to be, very collaborative and, fundamentally aligned. We talk a lot about drawing the funnel together so that the marketing funnel from suspect, prospect, and to MQL naturally flows into the sales funnel, and then recognizing that it has to come back around as prospects fall out of the sales process. And so in an ideal world, it really is a drawn funnel together.
That's it. And I love the fact that you say together, because I think oftentimes sales and marketing works in isolation. One of the perspectives that I've seen, especially in the mid-market, is that sales and marketing report to the C-suite, and generally it's a president, a CEO, and in a lot of cases, that president or CEO has not done either sales or marketing. I think this is actually another big source of tension for organizations, by not knowing that CEO, that president, while they're empowering their sales and marketing leader, they sometimes miss on how they should be doing the choreography. I think that's one of the biggest reasons, and the software as a service industry, in the last 10 years has pioneered the title Chief Revenue Officer. So smart people saw that there was this challenge in the marketplace with having a CEO or someone who's never managed sales try to manage sales and marketing. And so they came up with the CRO. The last thing I'll mention, just so we make sure that marketing is well represented, a CMO would argue that they might need to choreograph it because they're the tip of the spear. If they're responsible for creating the brand positioning, the thought leadership content, the messaging, and creating the leads, that maybe they should be the one leading. So you get a lot of different perspectives. At the end of the day, depending on the size of your organization, the person who sales and marketing report up into is ultimately going to dictate who choreographs this. And as your organization grows, you have to be really careful whether it's a chief sales officer, a chief marketing officer, and depending on who owns the ultimate choreography, they have to balance the interaction. And they have to make sure that, like James said, people are doing things together. So let's take a look at going a little deeper on messaging. And so this was another great factor that our team uncovered, that, when marketing and sales are aligned and there's consistent branding, they're seeing as much as a 23% lift in performance. And so to me, there's something to be said about getting on the same page and doing things together. Now, even though that makes sense, James, why are companies struggle with getting aligned on messaging?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a couple of places where that dysfunction gets added. One is that tension between who leads and not having clarity about who is leading. The other is really leadership component. You called that out on the flow chart early on. That often marketing is serving the CEO, preparing speeches and press-related oriented content, and is developing messages that may flow really well on a podium, but may not be accepted or flow through to the sales process as effectively. So what plays for an audience and marketing is writing for the CEO, I've seen this a number of times, then lands on the desk of a sales team that looks at it and says, I would not say this to a prospect. It's not going to be engaging. So you end up with a situation where the CEO is saying one thing and your salespeople are totally different. So you get this real division. So I think it's really important for the sales leaders and the marketing leaders to provoke that discussion, be able to push back on a CEO and make sure that messaging gets aligned across the spectrum.
That is such a great insight in terms of who is being served. The big challenge that I see is that if we go back to the leads and we go back to the marketing content and the messaging that marketing is putting out, oftentimes it can generate a lead, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a quality lead. And then sales gets frustrated that it's not a quality lead, yet they don't give marketing feedback. And marketing isn't going to find out, hey, was that a quality lead? So there are two ships in the night thinking that the other one isn't doing their job, and they're just not talking in order to raise the quality of that messaging. So I think that's another instance when whoever is leading it, if the leader ensures that sales and marketing are actually talking about, hey, that lead that's coming in, was it quality? What worked? What didn't work? And that collaboration will oftentimes drive an increase in quality of leads and ultimately better closing at the end, because at the beginning they had quality leads.
Absolutely.
Now, the other key thing around messaging that companies kind of also struggle with is there's having a clear brand positioning. So independent of the pandemic, most companies still struggle with how to position themselves, how to differentiate themselves, and then how to create content around thought leadership that helps them differentiate their service, their product. So whether you're a service or a product, more and more, even if a low-cost strategy at times helps you succeed, you've got to be differentiating yourself and you've got to be showing your value. Now, James, which of these two are you seeing people struggle more with?
It's often in the brand positioning element. And as you think about the messaging an organization does, the words that come out of a salesperson's mouth, probably the spot where you have the least amount of control. You can train, you can certify. When you send that salesperson out on the road, you can't monitor or even know what's being said. And it's really, really easy for the brand messages that are being carefully honed by a marketing team and a leadership team, not to cascade down to the sales team, or the sales team not to have the discipline to follow those key brand messages. The content, the thought leadership, the artifacts, and the collateral you can control for. They're printed, they're documents. The brand positioning often gets diverted with a freelancing sales team.
Now, in the product world, I think product knowledge is something that we can point to. That once upon a time, I was in the wine business, and product knowledge was incredibly important in order to differentiate yourself. Now, as I've over 10 years removed, I do a lot of work in SaaS and IT services. So what we've seen is the proliferation of the technical sale. And once again, that technical knowledge, that subject matter expertise, the amount of knowledge that sales has to have is growing. What's interesting is that marketing is a facilitator. And we go back to if marketing doesn't collaborate with sales in order to facilitate that service or product knowledge, that education process, you're right. Once sales is in the field or on the phone, it's difficult, and they're on their own. It's ultimately how did they prepare and what were they given to prepare? So it's another area that companies, certainly in the pandemic, have struggled even more. Now, what I, being someone who's very process driven, am very passionate about this, but this is another area that sales and marketing just can't seem to get aligned on the prospecting process. So when we break it down for our clients, we kind of break it up into 4 areas. So targeting is something that everyone understands really well. And one of the key issues is that we see people, they don't have the right targeting cadence. On the research side, great opportunity to research and go deep enough, yet people aren't going deep enough, even though they know better. And then we think about, are people spending enough time on planning and execution? And the choreography of time spent in each of these areas, it baffles me why companies don't make sales and marketing work together in these areas with greater frequency. So James, in these 4 areas, which do you see the companies that you work with struggling the most?
Yeah. So I think companies in general don't have enough discipline around this process, and then look and say, we're not getting the results we're looking for. Our outbound dialing and emailing isn't working. What's wrong? And the reality is many organizations haven't put the discipline into each one of these phases. Where I see, in organizations that do have meaningful calling shops, where they often kind of fail, is almost an over eagerness to jump on the phone and to get the emails blasted out, and under investing in that targeting and research phase. On the targeting list building activity, there's so much turnover in corporate roles. The average tenure around 18 months. People being promoted. You get organizations within companies changing functions, being reorganized. Lots of change. But those contact lists degrade at an extremely fast pace. So a contact list that was built, more than a quarter or two may only be 50 to 60% accurate in terms of the people in those roles. So prospecting needs to be, and reprospecting has to be, a quarterly activity. I just came off of working with a really great organization that has a dedicated prospecting research role. They're folks who spend all their time listing, when they're launching a new product, building the list. They do a great job at really building very well sort of targeted lookalike contacts, and then refreshing those on a quarterly basis, as well as building out what they call hit lists. So I'm going to spoke at a conference, someone appears in an article, there's a new job move, something relevant that would be really relevant for an outbound approach. It really needs to be a very active activity, and making sure that the lists are both big enough and small enough to be managed. One prospector can certainly move through hundreds or maybe even a couple thousand opportunities, but if you're doing research, you need to be able to turn over that list and be able to put the dedicated time. So making sure those lists are manageable and really building the workflows around that.
That's great, and I'll kind of double down on the cadence of targeting. I think although I might say I'm a big fan on enterprise sales, quarterly targeting makes a lot of sense. Depending on the size of accounts that you're selling to, some organizations might consider doing targeting as frequently as once a month. My concern is when companies don't have consistency. So they might do it in stops and spurts. And that's the great prospecting killer. It's hard to become good at prospecting if you're not doing with some level of consistency. And then the research piece, this is something that once again, people need to understand that when you research, you don't need to become an expert, certainly not until you've got a live conversation going. I've learned through other colleagues a great 3x3 method, 3 quick facts in 3 minutes as a starting point. And what we try to certainly advise our team members and our clients is that, what's the most amount of insight you can extract after the 3x3 in 15-minute increments? Oftentimes, a lot of target lists can be anywhere from 50, 75 contacts deep, especially depending on the segment that you're in. And so when you've got that many, someone else can do the research for you, but the challenge is you have to become an owner. You have to own that information so that way when you get on the phone, you can perform at your best. And so there's no shortcut in this particular area. And I urge our listeners to really rethink how much time they've been spending there and how much time their organization has been spending there. So when we think about the next challenge, it's very tool driven. And oftentimes marketing takes ownership of one of the tools and then sales takes ownership of the other. James, which of these tools are you seeing more challenges with in probably the last 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, it's very often the lack of tool integration, creating gaps in transparency across the relationships. The spot that often manifests is the Salesforce Pardot conflict, and they're underneath the same Salesforce roof, but data does not flow all that well across that. I'm working with a lot of clients who are using HubSpot, which has I think a little bit better integration. Really starts with a broader customer journey in mind, and acknowledges there can be all kinds of touches with a prospect and a client across the life cycle. So I say this is particularly important around transparency at a particular client level, so that if a prospect's part of a marketing drip campaign, receiving weekly and hopefully well-written messages from my company, that's a great thing for me as a seller. They're being warmed up, they're being exposed to value proposition. This is when sales and marketing is working well. Where the system fails is that the seller doesn't know what those messages are, when they're delivered, and then start sending duplicative or ill-timed or worse, kind of different messaging that doesn't support what's going out from the marketing team. So it's really powerful insight data. So if a seller knows yesterday a contact got a great well-written message about a topic, that seller then has a great opportunity to follow up on that. So it's really a transparency problem, and it's amazing. These tools, as amazing and powerful as they are, often don't address these really fundamental challenges.
Right, and I think certainly some of the challenges that I've seen are what you mentioned. And for starters, organizations are not putting quality information or content in, and so because they're not putting quality content or information in, what marketing produces through marketing automation, and when it goes to sales, that they're starting to have some frustration. And then we talked about in the beginning that there's not this collaboration between two parties of saying, hey, how did that lead go? So sales and marketing aren't reviewing the information in both systems with the consistency that they need to. I think there's the technical challenge of a lack of transparency. That could actually be resolved if people would make the time, both teams, if just the team leaders at a minimum, if not multiple members of the team, to kind of look at both systems together in order to see how do we improve what's going into marketing automation and how do we make sure what's moving into the CRM is being executed upon and we're creating a great feedback loop. Tools are meant to hopefully make us more efficient, and most teams are missing that from sales and marketing not collaborating. So the solution is, how do you bring some consistency of bringing those two parties together at looking at the tool? So the final area we're going to talk about is how sales and marketing need to get aligned on tactics. And the team found a great factoid from Marketo and StudyForce research that 63% more efficient at closing deals when they were aligned on tactics. So let's take a look at some of the tactics, because some of these suffered in the pandemic. Marketing teams have accelerated pushing out content. Webinars, we saw a rise in webinars. A lot of companies use this tactic even more in the pandemic. And then obviously events took a nosedive. And so companies, especially that went to trade shows, conventions, they've been really having some challenges because those were primary lead builders, and now that went away. So James, I'm curious, even though we've seen more webinars, a majority of companies are still struggling with them. Why do you think companies are struggling with webinars?
Yeah, I think it comes back to kind of relevance of content. There are very few webinars that are really pitches that will attract a strong audience. I come out of the Challenger insight-led sort of school of thought, and believe that it's imperative for a company to be teaching its customers, potential customers, something new about their own business, and bringing insight and data to that process. And I think there are a lot of companies that have intriguing data that they've failed to mine, information about their own client base and consumption patterns of software, information about how their software drives workflow changes, really understanding how their best customers consume and run different processes are really relevant to other potential buyers. And they fail to do that, sort of plumbing the depths of their own data and really doing deep customer exploration, doing those exercises. They become really natural fodder for very interesting webinars and very interesting content that should lead back to their product, but isn't really necessarily about their product.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. I think when companies take a long look at themselves, I think the pandemic especially was a shock to the system. And a lot of them had been wanting to get better at this. And I think the pandemic surprised them because they hadn't innovated. They hadn't been able to really showcase the things that maybe a few years ago were novel. Now they're old news. And so as companies look to exit the pandemic, they really need to think about what innovation are they bringing to their product, to their service, and how are they going to differentiate themselves? And a webinar is a great medium to share knowledge. Because there's so much good knowledge out there. If you don't bring good knowledge, people can jump to the wrong conclusion about your company. So the other tactics that sales tends to focus on, sales was big into networking. We saw that suffer in the pandemic. Everyone I spoke to, even though there was virtual networking, it just wasn't the same. There was calling, and there was a lot of thoughts on calling. Now, James, from your perspective, I think you saw some positive trends here. Will you share with our listeners kind of the trends that you saw?
Yeah, we really did. And it was I think, not what we expected. As we transitioned from reaching executives and being in an office ourselves, to everyone being at home, we really thought this was going to be the end of being able to access those executives by phone. And what happened was actually quite the contrary. I think many of the dialing databases and bases that people have built have cell phone numbers of our executives. And I saw this in my own experience, and then work with a couple of colleagues who run really high volume calling shops, where they're reaching out to thousands of executives on a weekly basis. And what they found was the acceptance of calls coming in on cell phones was very high. Executives pivoted to a remote environment, and they recognized that their cell phone sitting in front of them was their access to the world. And surprisingly or not surprisingly, they picked up the phone. And rates of what they call call to connect, the number of calls that you actually get a person to pick up, went up almost 2x over the period. I found it's really held up to the point that I have multiple executives from big companies who I'm in text contact with, which really was a shift from just a year or two ago when I would never, bother an executive on their cell phone. There was sort of a kind of a church and state wall there. I feel like the pandemic has kind of broken that down a little bit. Certainly, you can't spam people. Certainly, the cell phone and the text has to be used very sparingly. I'm really good acceptance of it. So I think it was sort of one of the interesting factors. And it'll be interesting to see as we go back to the office what the pattern is. Do executives still pick up the phone?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think on calling, I think one of the great silver linings of the pandemic is every sales organization, whether you were used to doing this or not, got exponentially more comfortable recording calls. And by recording calls, inside sales is used to having their calls recorded. Now, all sales teams are a lot more used to this. And recording your calls, there's great technology out there that you can record a call, record a webinar. And by doing that, you can actually watch yourself or listen to yourself. And it's going to only be a more competitive market as we're exiting the pandemic. And it's critical for people to raise their game. And, a colleague, Steve Richards, talks about, when you listen to your call, it's like watching game film. And I think it's vital in order to be the best professional possible that you spend time on listening to yourself or watching yourself in how you're trying to engage a prospect. And I think the people who are the highest levels of professionalism that want to be better will do these and get used to and get more value out of it. So it's something that more people now have been exposed, are comfortable, and are using this tool in order to improve. So I think one of the things that marketing can greatly help is by watching those as well and really understanding what is going well and what isn't. And then the final thing that we saw do really well was just the leveraging of introductions. If anything, the people with the strongest amount of goodwill and spheres of influence were able to do well in the pandemic, while people who hadn't invested in their spheres of influence really struggled with some of the segments they had to sell into and not necessarily having the same level of success for a variety of different reasons. So these are the tactics that we kind of talk about. So as we kind of summarize, we kind of talked about the ownership of choreography. We talked about messaging. We talked about process. We talked about tools, and we talked about tactics. And one of the key things, the common theme is, and it all starts with leadership. If leadership is choreographing this, if leadership is choreographing sales and marketing, then over time, all of these challenges can go away. It's natural for two completely separate departments really struggle to always be aligned. So organizations have to invest enough time on a consistent basis to move their sales and marketing teams from experiencing a lot of red to becoming a finely tuned customer acquisition machine. So we've gone over how to break the walls down for sales and marketing. Truett, do we have any questions from the group in order to cover or review anything? Because we threw a lot at the crowd.
Yeah, it looks like I got two right now. The first, to improve one part of the customer acquisition model, what will have the greatest impact and what should I choose?
James, I'll let you go first, and then I'll give.
Yeah, it's a heck of a question. I think the kind of the first primary question is really about alignment, and this is really the most important element. And I'd say perhaps there are multiple people involved, or if there's a single person, it's a question of starting from the client and working back. What are the buying behaviors? What are the elements? And then working backwards from that to develop sales messaging and marketing messaging and delivery that speaks to that end buyer, without having a sense of kind of what might be broken in the context. That's where I'd put a lot of the energy.
Yeah, and Truett, do me a favor. Can you restate the question one more time? Because I just want to listen to it, because I think it was layered.
Sure. Yeah. I'll try to restate it so it's a little more clear. So like with the customer acquisition model, there's like a bunch of different layers and then also like parts to each of those layers, like messaging, different types of content, etc. And so what they're asking is if they only have the time to focus on one of those things, what should it be? What will have the most impact?
So from my perspective, the area to focus would be the process of targeting, research, planning, and execution. Because oftentimes process, if everyone agrees to it and spends time doing it at the right cadence, it will actually help people come together. So if, let's say, depending on who can preside over the meeting of sales and marketing, so we've got sales coming to the table, we've got marketing coming to the table, and if they were to focus on targeting, research, planning, execution, if they just focus on targeting first, that's a collaborative experience. Then who can do the research, then who engages in the planning of that, how they're going to engage the target, and then the ultimate execution. Having an agreed upon process and working on it together, something sounds simple, but companies still struggle doing that. And we found just by that oftentimes can be a great way to start building collaboration, but not a silver bullet. And if you can only invest in one area, you have to invest a certain amount of time to build consensus, alignment, and choreography in that process. So hopefully that was helpful. I have the second question up in terms of, when the CEO is not involved, what's your suggestion to bring sales and marketing to the table? James, you want to start off and I'll finish?
Yeah, this is the key potential conflict area, and it's on each of those executives in sales and marketing to bring the right perspective to the table. And be ready to be constructive in that. I recognize maybe that that often doesn't happen. There are cultural dynamics. There are sort of metrics and activities that are quite different in each one of the disciplines. Some of the tools that I've seen really effective, and when I've had really strong relationships with CMOs or sales teams when I was in a marketing capacity, has really been about sort of provoking where there might be conflict. So I talked a little bit earlier about drawing the funnel together. This is about handoffs. This is about having the same metrics. The second is, on messaging, making sure the messaging is aligned, and then embedding the marketing team all the way at the sales end. So making sure that sales gives feedback, making sure that marketing leaders can participate in sales interactions, hear how messaging plays out in the real world. If you start doing these things, you start getting much more aligned perspective. And then, I would say ultimately, if you've got a CMO and a head of sales that are not cooperating, it's a leadership issue. The CEO needs to be involved to say, one message oriented, figure it out. You two need to sort this out. It's really a management dysfunction, less a question of anything in marketing and sales.
Well, and on that, we've seen some workarounds. So some workarounds that actually worked surprisingly well. Two versions. In one case, a COO served as the arbitrator. So someone very ops driven, got in between of sales and marketing and did a great job of facilitating. And really didn't want to tell sales how to do their job marketing, but was very focused on solving the management dysfunction. And so I think that worked really well. In another case, we saw a CFO play that role. And I actually thought it was a recipe for disaster, and I was actually incorrect. What the CFO was able to bring was trying to use dollars and cents as a means of building a bridge. And really saying, hey, this is where marketing is investing. Sales, how are you getting an ROI for marketing? And vice versa. Marketing, are you investing in the right places to get sales what they need? So it was a different lens. It helped build a bridge. And by having that bridge, made a huge difference in order to get the teams to collaborate far more effectively. So that was kind of our experience from the trenches. Truett, I think we have satisfied all the questions, or do we have any more?
Nope, that's it on my end.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. As always, Truett, thank you for being a great producer. James, thank you for joining us today. Alex Bartholomew, CEO, People Stretch Solutions. Here's our contact information. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.